The coffee shop on Station Gamma 7 hummed with the quiet chatter of a dozen different species. Sat in the corner booth, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, watching the steam rise like ghosts from her past. To anyone looking, she was just another retired human, probably a former engineer or maybe a small-time trader. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were the kind of practical wear that suggested someone who valued comfort over style. But if they looked closer, really looked, they might notice things. The way her eyes constantly swept the room, cataloging exits and potential threats. How she sat with her back to the wall and a clear view of every entrance. The small scars that crisscrossed her knuckles, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The slight bulge under her left arm where someone might keep a concealed weapon. Commander of the Imperial Navy didn't notice these details when he first spotted her. The 8-foot-tall reptilian warrior was too focused on his own problems. His crimson scales were dulled with exhaustion, and his usually pristine uniform was wrinkled from days of travel. He'd been hunting across 3 sectors for any trace of the legendary human warrior known only as the Silent Death. 20 years ago, during the Terran War, this mysterious figure had single-handedly destroyed an entire battle fleet. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through tactics so brilliant and execution so flawless that military academies across the galaxy still studied the engagement. The human had appeared from nowhere, struck with surgical precision, and vanished again without a trace. No name, no face, no identity, just a ghost that had turned the tide of the war and disappeared into legend. Had been a junior officer on one of the ships that survived that day. He'd watched in horror as his colleagues died not from human brutality, but from their own weapons turned against them through impossible strategic manipulation. The human had used the fleet's own strengths against them, creating a cascade of tactical failures that resulted in complete annihilation. Now, as the new head of military intelligence, had made finding this phantom his personal mission. His people needed to understand how one human had achieved the impossible. They needed to learn from it, or more importantly, they needed to make sure it could never happen again. The trail had been cold for decades, but recent intelligence suggested the warrior might be somewhere in this sector. Had been following leads for weeks, interviewing retired veterans and checking passenger manifests, all while trying to piece together the identity of someone who had never officially existed. As he entered the coffee shop, scanning for anyone who might have military bearing, his eyes passed over the gray-haired woman in the corner. She looked up briefly as he entered, their eyes meeting for just a moment before she returned to her coffee. She was invisible, exactly as she intended. Took another sip of her coffee and allowed herself a small, bitter smile. She recognized the immediately. Not personally, but she knew the type. The way he carried himself, the subtle tactical awareness in his movements, the slight favor he gave to his right side where an old wound probably still ached. She'd seen thousands like him during the war. What amused her wasn't that he was looking for her. She'd expected this day would come eventually. What amused her was how thoroughly he dismissed her as a threat. In his mind, the Silent Death was probably still young, still active, still dangerous. He was looking for a warrior, not a middle-aged woman drinking coffee and reading news feeds on her tablet. The war had ended differently than the history books recorded. Yes, humanity had achieved a stalemate that led to peace, but the real victory had been much more subtle. While the galaxy focused on the big battles and dramatic space engagements, a small group of humans had been fighting a different kind of war. They'd been the ghosts in the machine, the whispers in the dark, the impossible victories that couldn't be explained. Had been one of them, perhaps the best of them. But that was 20 years ago, and she'd been living quietly ever since. She'd chosen this life of deliberate invisibility, moving from station to station, taking small jobs, keeping her head down. She'd watched the galaxy change around her, seen humanity take its place among the galactic community as equals rather than newcomers. She'd seen the peace hold, and she'd been content to let her legend remain just that, a legend. There was questioning the barista now, showing what looked like old military records on his tablet. The young behind the counter was shaking his head politely, clearly having no useful information to offer. Moved to the next table, then the next, working his way systematically through the coffee shop. Finished her coffee and stood up slowly, making sure to favor her left knee slightly as if it bothered her. She'd been practicing the movements of an aging civilian for so long that they came naturally now. She gathered her things unhurriedly, checked her tablet one more time, and headed for the exit. As she passed the table, she stumbled slightly, catching herself on his chair. "Oh, excuse me," she said in the slightly breathless voice of someone embarrassed by their own clumsiness. "I'm so sorry." "No harm done," replied automatically, barely glancing up from his conversation with a merchant trader who clearly knew nothing about military history. Smiled apologetically and continued toward the exit, but not before her trained fingers had slipped a small data chip into the hidden pocket of his uniform jacket. Old habits died hard, and if someone was going to hunt for the silent death, they might as well get pointed in the right direction. The chip contained coordinates to an abandoned mining facility 3 systems away, along with a single message. "If you want to find her, prove you're worthy of the hunt." Outside the coffee shop, walked at the steady pace of someone with nowhere important to be. But her mind was already working, calculating possibilities and preparing for what might come next. She'd hoped for a few more years of peace, but maybe it was time to see if the galaxy had learned anything from the war. Maybe it was time to see if humanity's reputation still meant what it used to. 3 hours later, discovered the chip during his standard security sweep of his belongings. His hands trembled slightly as he read the message, not from fear but from excitement. After 20 years of hunting, he finally had a real lead. He didn't notice the small tracking device that had been attached to his ship's hull, or the fact that his hotel room had been quietly searched while he was in the coffee shop. He didn't realize that every move he'd made since arriving at the station had been carefully observed, and the silent death was indeed watching him. But retired civilian was just another invisible face in the crowd. As she boarded a transport to the next system, allowed herself to wonder what kind of warrior this really was. The war had produced veterans on both sides, but very few had the persistence to hunt a ghost for 20 years. Perhaps he was different from the others she'd encountered over the years. Perhaps this would actually be interesting. The transport pulled away from the station, carrying its passengers toward their various destinations. In seat 47C, an unremarkable woman closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be feared across the galaxy. Soon, she might need to remember more than that. The abandoned mining facility hung in the darkness between 2 dead stars, a twisted metal corpse slowly rotating in the endless night. Commander's ship approached cautiously, its sensors sweeping for any signs of life or hidden weapons. The facility had been stripped of anything valuable decades ago, leaving behind only the skeleton of what had once been a thriving operation. According to the coordinates on the mysterious chip, this was where he would find his answers. Didn't believe it would be that simple, but he'd come this far. His entire career had been built around understanding human tactical thinking, and this felt like exactly the kind of psychological game a human would play. What he didn't expect was for his ship's communication system to activate the moment he entered the facility's sensor range. "Commander," a woman's voice spoke through the static, calm and clear. "You may dock at Port 7, come alone and bring only standard sidearms. Anything more aggressive will be considered hostile intent." The voice was human, unmistakably female, with the kind of steady confidence that suggested someone accustomed to giving orders that were never questioned. Claws tightened on his command chair's armrests. After 20 years of hunting shadows, was he finally about to meet his quarry? Port 7 was functional despite the facility's apparent abandonment. Gravity generators hummed to life as his ship settled into the dock, and an airlock tunnel extended to create a secure connection. Someone had been maintaining essential systems, which meant someone had been here recently. Holstered his plasma pistol and stepped through the airlock into a dimly lit corridor. Emergency lighting strips provided just enough illumination to navigate, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move with each step. The facility felt empty but not abandoned, more like a sleeping giant that might wake at any moment. He followed a series of soft light indicators that led him deeper into the facility's core. The path took him past empty cargo bays and stripped equipment chambers, through sections that had once housed thousands of miners and their families. Now they were ghost rooms, filled only with the whispers of recycled air and distant mechanical sounds. The journey ended at what had once been the facility's central command center. Most of the equipment had been removed, but someone had set up a small table and 2 chairs in the center of the room. A single overhead light cast a circle of brightness around this impromptu meeting space, leaving the rest of the room in comfortable darkness. The woman was already there, sitting with her back to a wall that offered views of all the room's entrances. She was perhaps 50 years old, with gray-streaked brown hair and the kind of lean build that suggested regular physical conditioning rather than natural genetics. Her clothes were simple civilian wear, but she carried herself with the unconscious authority of someone who had commanded respect in dangerous places. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I apologize for the dramatic setting, but I thought you might appreciate the privacy." Remained standing, studying her carefully. She looked familiar, but he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "You're the one who left me the chip." "I am," she smiled slightly, "though I suspect you have questions about who I actually am." "Are you her? Are you the silent death?" The woman was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming silently on the table's surface. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "That's not a name I chose for myself," she said. "Your people gave me that designation after the Battle of Edge. Before that, I was just Lieutenant Commander, Terran Special Operations." His legs suddenly felt weak, and he sank into the offered chair without conscious thought. This unremarkable middle-aged woman was the phantom that had haunted nightmares for 2 decades. The tactical genius who had turned an entire fleet into scrap metal using nothing but superior strategy and perfect execution. "You were there," she continued, watching his reaction carefully. "Third Battle Group, heavy cruiser. You survived because your captain made the smart choice and jumped out of the system when it became clear what was happening." "How do you?" began, then stopped. Of course she would know. Someone who could orchestrate that level of tactical precision would naturally have studied every ship, every commander, every possible variable in the engagement. Leaned back in her chair, and for the first time caught a glimpse of the warrior she'd once been. It wasn't in her appearance. She still looked like a retired civilian, but in the way her eyes assessed him, strengths and weaknesses with professional efficiency. "You've been hunting me for 20 years, she said. "That suggests either an admirable dedication to understanding your enemies or a personal vendetta. Which is it?" "Understanding," replied immediately. "My people need to know how you did what you did, not to seek revenge but to learn from it, to make sure we never make those mistakes again." Nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Revenge would have meant this meeting ended very differently." She stood and walked to a wall panel that hadn't noticed was actually a hidden display screen. With a few quick touches, it came alive with a 3-dimensional tactical map of this edge system, as it had been during the battle. "Tell me what you remember about that day," she said. Studied the display, memory pulling him back to one of the most terrifying experiences of his career. "We'd cornered a human supply convoy in the asteroid field. Intelligence said it was lightly defended, maybe a few escort frigates at most. Easy prey." The display updated to show fleet positions as they had been at the start of the engagement. 12 heavy cruisers, 8 destroyers, and a full complement of fighter squadrons. More than enough firepower to eliminate a convoy and its escorts. "But it wasn't a convoy," continued. "It was a trap. The cargo ships were actually loaded with sensor jammers and decoy transmitters. By the time we realized what was happening, we couldn't tell real targets from false ones." "And then," prompted. "Then you appeared, one ship, one human ship against our entire fleet. It should have been suicide." His voice grew quiet as he relived the memory. "But you used our own formation against us. Somehow you calculated our firing solutions before we did, positioned yourself so that when we fired on you, we hit our own ships instead." The display shifted to show the engagement's progression, with a single small ship dancing through the massive formation like a deadly ballet. Red lines indicated weapons fire, and watched in fascination as the human ship seemed to predict every move before it was made. "You turned us into friendly fire incidents," he whispered. "We destroyed our own fleet trying to kill you." Returned to her chair, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't magic, Commander. It was mathematics, psychology, and very careful preparation. Your tactical doctrine at the time was rigid, predictable. You trained your crews to respond to specific threats in specific ways. Once I understood your standard operating procedures, I could manipulate them." "But the precision required," shook his head. "The calculations alone would have taken supercomputers hours to process." "Which is why I spent 3 months preparing for that single engagement," replied. "I studied every fleet engagement for the previous 5 years. I analyzed your command structure, your communication protocols, your weapon systems targeting parameters. I ran 10,000 simulations until I could predict your responses with 97% accuracy. She touched the display again, and it shifted to show her ship's actual flight path through the battle. It was a work of art, realized, a perfect dance of physics and psychology that had turned overwhelming enemy strength into fatal weakness. This is what your people don't understand about human warfare, continued. You focus on superior numbers, better weapons, stronger armor. You think victory comes from having more power than your opponent. But humans learned long ago that the greatest victories come from making your enemy defeat themselves. Studied the tactical display with new understanding. You're saying this was typical human strategy. I'm saying this was human nature applied to military science. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced. But we're very good at understanding our enemies and using their own nature against them. She stood again, this time walking to a viewing port that looked out into the empty space around the facility. Your people have learned since then. Your tactical doctrine has evolved, become more flexible. You've studied human approaches to warfare and incorporated what works into your own methods. That's why the peace has held. Both our species have grown beyond what we were during the war. Joined her at the viewing port, trying to process everything he'd learned. So why reveal yourself now? Why end 20 years of hiding? Was quiet for a long moment, her reflection ghost-like in the reinforced glass. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. Because the galaxy is changing again, Commander. New threats are emerging, and the peace between our species may not be enough to face them. Intelligence suggests something is moving in the Outer Rim territories, something that makes our old war look like a minor disagreement between friends. She turned to face him directly. Your people and mine are going to need each other if we want to survive what's coming, and that means old warriors like us need to stop hiding from the past and start preparing for the future. Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's recycled air. What kind of threats? The kind that don't care about politics or diplomacy or carefully negotiated peace treaties, replied. The kind that see both our species as obstacles to be removed rather than civilizations to be respected. She handed him a data pad containing encrypted files. Everything I've learned about human special operations doctrine is on there. Not just my methods, but the techniques of every human operative from the war. Consider it a gesture of trust, and a recognition that we're going to need to trust each other if we want to survive what's coming. Took the pad with trembling hands, understanding that he was holding knowledge that could revolutionize military thinking. Why trust me with this? Because you spent 20 years hunting a ghost out of professional curiosity rather than personal hatred, replied. Because your people chose to learn from their defeats rather than simply seeking revenge. And because I've been watching you, Commander, and I believe you're the kind of warrior who fights to protect rather than to conquer. She moved toward one of the room's exits, then paused. One last thing, Commander. The Silent Death was a title created by fear and legend, but is very much alive, and she's tired of existing in silence. If your intelligence is correct about what's coming from the Outer Rim, you're going to need her soon. Where will you go? Asked. Smiled, and for a moment she looked like the warrior from the legends again. Back to work. It seems the galaxy needs reminding of what humans can accomplish when we stop being polite. She disappeared into the shadows of the facility's corridors, leaving alone with his thoughts and a data pad full of secrets. By the time he made his way back to his ship, the facility's life support had shut down and its docking ports had sealed. As he pulled away from the abandoned structure, he could see no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. But the data pad was real, and its contents would change everything. The Silent Death was no longer silent, and the galaxy was about to remember why that should terrify its enemies. 6 months after the meeting at the abandoned mining facility, the Outer Rim colonies began going silent one by one. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply silent. Ships would arrive to find empty settlements with all infrastructure intact, as if the populations had simply vanished into the void. The few automated distress beacons that managed to transmit before being cut off spoke of impossible ships that moved without engine signatures and weapons that killed without leaving traces. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions, but their debates produced nothing but fear and confusion. Military forces from a dozen species were dispatched to investigate, and most never returned. Those that did brought back reports so contradictory and bizarre that they were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. Commander stood in the war room of the flagship Doom's Herald, studying tactical displays that made no sense. 3 entire fleets had vanished while investigating the outer rim anomalies. Long-range sensors showed movement that known physics, and communication intercepts contained signals that seemed to bypass conventional spacetime entirely. "Sir," his aide approached cautiously, "we've received a priority transmission from Terran Command. It's encoded with the special operations protocols you requested we monitor." Felt his pulse quicken. Since their meeting at the mining facility, he'd been sharing intelligence with through carefully encrypted channels. Her insights into human tactical thinking had helped them avoid several disasters, but they still had no clear picture of what they were facing. The transmission was brief and direct in its typically efficient style. "Target identified, automated harvest ships from somewhere beyond known space. They're not invading, they're collecting. Biological specimens, technology samples, cultural data, entire populations being taken for study. Traditional fleet responses are useless against this level of technological superiority. New approach required. Meet at coordinates attached. Come prepared for unconventional warfare. Time is running out." The coordinates led to a small asteroid mining station near the edge of Terran space. When ship arrived, he found it unusually busy for such a remote location. Ships from multiple species were docked at the station, but not military vessels. These were civilian transports, cargo haulers, and small private craft, the kind of ships that would normally be ignored by anyone planning serious military operations. Met him at the airlock, but she was no longer the quiet civilian he'd encountered months earlier. She wore dark tactical gear that seemed to bend light around its edges, and carried equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. More importantly, she carried herself with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him through corridors filled with beings he didn't recognize. "I know this looks unusual, but conventional approaches aren't going to work against what we're facing." The station's central cargo bay had been converted into a briefing room. Dozens of individuals from various species sat at improvised tables, but quickly realized these weren't regular military personnel. They moved with the particular kind of controlled awareness that marked special operations veterans, intelligence agents, and professional troublemakers. "Ladies and honored beings," announced as she took position at the front of the room. "Thank you all for answering the call. I know many of you thought your war days were over, but it seems the universe has other plans." She activated a holographic display showing the outer rim territories. Red zones marked the areas where colonies had gone silent, and the pattern was clearly expanding toward more populated systems. "What we're facing isn't an invasion in any traditional sense," continued. "Our enemies, and we still don't know exactly what they are, have technology so advanced that they can simply take whatever they want without meaningful resistance. They're not interested in conquest or communication. They're collecting samples, and we are the specimens." A operative raised a tentacle. "If their technology is so superior, how do we fight them?" "We don't fight their technology," replied. "We fight them the way humans have always fought superior opponents, by being unpredictable, adaptable, and absolutely ruthless in exploiting any weakness we can find." The display shifted to show intelligence gathered from the few survivors who'd managed to escape the collection operations. The enemy ships were vast, smooth constructs that seemed to phase in and out of normal space at will. Their collection methods were precise and methodical, suggesting advanced planning and detailed knowledge of their targets. "They know too much about us," observed an intelligence specialist that recognized. "They target specific individuals, specific technologies. Someone is providing them with detailed information about our capabilities." "Which brings us to our first advantage," said with a predatory smile. "They know what we were, they don't know what we're becoming." She gestured to the assembled group. "Everyone in this room is officially dead, retired, or operating outside normal command structures. We don't exist in any databases they might have accessed. We're not part of any official military organization they could study or predict. We are, effectively, ghosts fighting other ghosts." A human operative that didn't recognize spoke up. "What's the plan? We can't exactly board their ships and plant explosives if they can phase out of normal space." "Actually," replied, "that's exactly what we're going to do, but not in the way you're thinking." The display changed again, showing technical schematics that hurt to look at directly. The designs seemed to fold back on themselves in ways that conventional understanding of three-dimensional space. For the past 6 months, human scientists have been working with engineers and mathematicians to develop something new, explained. A ship that can follow our enemies into whatever dimensional space they use for their collection operations. It's based on human adaptability principles, durability concepts, and spatial mathematics. Studied the schematics with growing amazement. The ship design incorporated elements from a dozen different technological approaches, creating something that was probably impossible according to conventional physics, but might actually work according to the newer theories being developed by joint species research teams. The catch, continued, is that we can only build one prototype and will only get one chance to use it. Once our enemies understand what we're capable of, they'll adapt their defenses. This has to be a single strike that either solves the problem or gives the regular military forces information they can use to develop a long-term solution. A draconian operative hissed softly, "Suicide mission, then." "Probably," agreed cheerfully. "But the kind of suicide mission that might save entire civilizations, the kind that makes the sacrifice worthwhile." Found himself volunteering before he consciously decided to speak. "What do you need from us?" His expression softened slightly as she looked at him. "I need the best warriors from every species represented here. I need people who can think creatively under impossible pressure. I need soldiers who can work together even when everything they know about tactics and strategy becomes useless." She paused, looking around the room at faces that had seen too many wars and lost too many friends. "And I need volunteers who understand that this mission might end with all of us being collected as specimens by entities that see us as interesting insects." Every hand in the room went up. 3 weeks later, the hybrid ship launched from a hidden facility in an unnamed system. It was an ugly, asymmetrical vessel that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and hope. Its crew of 37 beings represented the most experienced special operations veterans from across known space, united by a common understanding that conventional approaches had failed. Stood on the bridge as they approached the outer rim territories, watching displays that showed the reality-bending effects of their experimental drive system. The ship was partially existing in the same dimensional space that their enemies used, making it effectively invisible to normal sensors while allowing them to track the collection ships. "Contact," announced the sensor specialist. "Large vessel bearing 27 Mark 6. Configuration matches survivor descriptions." The main display showed something that easy description. The enemy ship was massive, possibly larger than anything in any known fleet, but it seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Parts of it were clearly visible while other sections phased in and out of perception like mirages. "Take us closer," ordered. "Remember, we're not trying to destroy it. We're trying to understand it well enough to give our people a fighting chance." As they approached, the ship's true purpose became clear. It wasn't just a collection vessel, it was a mobile laboratory. Through the phased sections, they could see vast holding areas filled with specimens from dozens of species and worlds. Some were being studied, others were being processed, and some appeared to be undergoing alterations that changed them into something unrecognizable. "By the ancestors," breathed a gunner. "They're not just collecting samples, they're experimenting on entire populations." "Which means they're planning something bigger than just research," replied grimly. "They're preparing for something." The enemy ship suddenly became fully visible as it dropped out of phase space to begin another collection operation. Below them, a small research station orbited a gas giant, its inhabitants completely unaware of the doom approaching from dimensions they couldn't perceive. "This is it," announced to her crew. "We board their ship, we gather intelligence, and we plant the beacon that will let our fleets track them. Remember, we're not heroes trying to save everyone. We're soldiers trying to give our species the information they need to save themselves." The boarding operation was like nothing any of them had experienced before. Their experimental ship could phase partially into the enemy vessel, allowing them to bypass conventional defenses, but the interior of the collection shipped every assumption about architecture and physics. Corridors bent back on themselves. Rooms existed in multiple locations simultaneously. The very air seemed to process information in ways that made their thoughts feel sluggish and confused. But they were veterans of impossible missions, and they adapted. The human team members used their species' legendary flexibility to navigate spatial anomalies. The warriors provided anchor points of stability that kept the team grounded in conventional reality. The specialists used their mathematical intuition to map impossible geometries. They fought their way through automated defenses that existed in multiple dimensions, rescued what specimens they could, and planted monitoring devices that would let the galactic fleets track the collection ship's movements. And they learned the truth. The entities operating the collection ships weren't invaders from another galaxy. They were the remnants of the previous galactic civilization, the one that had existed before any of the current species had achieved. They'd transcended normal spacetime to escape some ancient catastrophe, but the process had cost them their physical forms and most of their individual consciousness. Now they existed as a collective intelligence spread across multiple dimensions, desperately trying to understand how biological life had evolved to replace them. Their collection operations weren't preparation for conquest. They were attempts to discover how to regain their lost individuality and physical existence. They weren't monsters. They were refugees who had become monstrous in their desperation to remember what they'd once been. Wen and her team finally escaped the collection ship. They carried with them not just vital intelligence, but a possible solution. The entities could be communicated with, reasoned with, perhaps even helped. But it would require cooperation between species on a scale never before attempted, and it would require trusting former enemies to work toward a common goal. As their battered ship limped back toward civilized space, found standing alone in the observation lounge, staring out at stars that suddenly seemed very fragile and precious. "Regrets?" he asked. "About the mission? No." She turned to face him, and he was startled to see that she was smiling. "About spending 20 years hiding when I could have been building the relationships that made this possible. Maybe. You're not planning to disappear again after this, are you?" Laughed, a sound with real warmth in it. "Commander, after what we've learned, I don't think any of us get to disappear anymore. The galaxy is going to need its veterans, its warriors, its troublemakers. We're going to have to teach the next generation that sometimes the most important battles are fought not to defeat enemies, but to understand them." 6 months later, the first joint diplomatic mission to contact the entities launched from Earth, crewed by volunteers from every major species. The mission was led by a certain former ghost who had finally decided that existing in silence was a luxury the galaxy could no longer afford. The stars, it seemed, were full of refugees and warriors, and sometimes the difference between the two was nothing more than time and understanding. Was no longer the silent death. She had become something more dangerous, a bridge between worlds, a translator of impossible conflicts, and proof that the most powerful human weapon had always been the ability to find hope in hopeless situations. The galaxy, she thought as she watched the diplomatic ship disappear into dimensions beyond normal space, was about to learn that lesson all over again.